Hello and welcome, comrades. How many classes, socioeconomic classes that is, are there? How granular can you get when identifying different classes? Is there a lower, middle, and upper class? Are there lower middle and upper middle classes? Are there lower and upper classes? Is there such a class as the 1%? How much granular sussing out of class is necessary? While I may end up seeming to contradict myself later in this video and later videos on the channel due to the nuance involved in the issue, I'm going to go out on a limb and say there are two classes. Those people who primarily or fully earn their living through ownership, and those who earn their living through selling their labor. Stuffy socialists throughout history have referred to these classes as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, respectively. Or, to put it another way, capitalists and workers. What I'm arguing is that unlike the way Americans think of class as a function of how much money someone makes, how many assets they have, how comfortable they are, class is actually a function of one's relationship with the means of production, i.e., the infrastructure, tools, and raw materials used in making that which society uses. While history has made things a little messy, if we take a large scale view of how people relate to the economy, we can still make some claims about relational dynamics that apply to both nascent capitalism and that whole late stage capitalism everybody's talking about. There are some in the bourgeoisie who may keep busy throughout the day. They may give off the impression of working, but they either currently possess or could potentially possess the option to simply stop doing anything, hire someone to do any semblance of work they have been doing, and simply not do anything except check in on things every so often and collect money by virtue of merely owning something. Now, we'll get into what that something is that they own and what their relationship is to what they own in terms of work put into making that thing lucrative. But for now, we can just be satisfied with the fact that the bourgeoisie don't really need to work, and to the extent they do work, that's not how they earn their money. The proletariat, on the other hand, work for their money by selling their labor. They don't own the things that make money, they work for the owners of the things that make money. I understand I'm being vague and fuzzy with some of the language, overusing the word things and giving the impression I have a limited vocabulary, but that's just because I'm rolling out concepts as they become relevant. To that end, I think it's important to talk about property, the aforementioned things. Often, what is thought of when property is discussed is the personal property that most people, even the proletariat, have in their possession: house, car, cell phone, computer, electric 12-string bass guitar. But what we're concerned about in this discussion is what socialists usually call private property, which, yeah, still evokes the image of personal property because things like houses and the land a house is on are colloquially called private property. However, by private property, we mean anything that is used in commodity production or has some other productive value to a private owner, such as factories, farms, banks, stores, and other businesses, companies, and corporations. A private institution can be a small business owned by one person. It can be a large corporation owned by a nebulous group of investors, or it can manifest as any number of legal entities that share the common trait of being privately owned. Whereas in the past, identifying the bourgeoisie was easier in the early days of capitalism, we live in a time where the largest and most powerful, and therefore most easily boogie-peopled, private institutions manifest in large corporations that don't have a clearly identified ownership. The robber baron titan of industry of old has been replaced by boards of directors and stockholders as the persona non grata of skeptics of capitalism. Having said that, I think it's appropriate to cover at this point just how differently bourgeois individuals relate to the private property they own. The idealized figure in capitalist society, call them the backbone of America, call them the small business owner, call them the petite bourgeoisie. However you call this segment of the capitalist class, they are those who own productive private property or capital, but primarily work for themselves or employ a relatively small number of people. Although the legal definition of a small business can permit hundreds or even in excess of 1,000 employees. Think of a laundromat owned by one person or owned jointly by a married couple. Think a small bodega owned by a person that employs a few members of their family. While the concept of a petite bourgeoisie small business owner may not have a broadly understood denotation, unless you're considering a legal designation in this or that jurisdiction, I think it's helpful to consider whose labor is being exploited. Does the business owner work for themselves? Is it a partnership of a few individuals that all share ownership of and work for the business together? Is it a person who employs a few of their nieces and nephews? For many people, even those who are skeptical of capitalism and bemoan capitalist exploitation of labor, this type of business ownership doesn't really seem that oppressive, especially for those who consider large multinational corporations as a perversion of a social order that would be ideal if it operated completely on the scale of small businesses. However, at what point does the average person consider owner-worker dynamics antagonistic, if not exploitative? Does a business that employs 20 workers feel like it has the same dynamic as the aforementioned innocuous examples? Does a 100-person operation evoke the same image of a harmless mom-and-pop shop? Businesses of increasingly large size tend toward a relationship to capital where the owner isn't doing much in the way of work, especially not to the same extent as someone who owns a business that employs only a few people. And as mentioned previously, the work the owner of a business puts into their business isn't how they make their money. Rather, it is by dint of their ownership that earns them money. Other companies, on the other hand, have offered up some stake in ownership of the company, called stocks, to be purchased by members of the general public. These are known as publicly traded companies. Many of the largest companies, in fact, sell shares of ownership in the company on the open market. In many cases, it's not enough for a single person, or a large group of people for that matter, to possess a majority stake to such a point where they have any say in dictating their direction of the company. A person with a majority of the controlling interests in company stocks can, in a way, be considered the owner by virtue of their majority share, giving them a status in the company, unlike others with a lower percentage ownership of stocks. And it's likely in the cases where there's a single majority shareholder, they're probably the founder of the company and serve in some other higher decision-making executive position. The very tip top of the largest companies have no one single majority shareholder in the company. Thus, there's no one person to point to as the owner. For example, Apple's single largest shareholder, Arthur Levinson, owns just over 1.1 million shares, accounting for just 0.03% of total shares. Apple CEO Tim Cook owns a little under 1 million shares, or about 0.02% of the company. With such a large number of stocks available and such a tiny fraction of stocks being owned by any one person, there's no room for any one person to unilaterally act in the capacity of an owner in such cases. Boards of directors are entities in a company that represent the interests of stockholders and act in a way similar to owners in that they hire people to executive positions and make other decisions that would be the prerogative of an owner in other business models. Companies may sell some amount of stock in the company to raise capital for one reason or another, and if the capital raised has the desired effect of increasing the profitability of the company, those stocks sold can be bought back. I know I've been discussing one class over another, and this isn't a reflection of how important I think the bourgeoisie class is relative to workers, but identifying the proletarian class is just that much simpler. I guess there are those who might see a blurring of lines when it comes to highly paid workers, but I think this is why focusing on pay really just serves to obscure class dynamics. To be sure, though, that's one of the primary reasons class is usually understood as a function of pay or occupation. A lawyer who is just a salaried employee of a law firm but has no ownership stake, but nonetheless makes a six-figure income, probably doesn't see themselves in alliance with and having the same class interests as a gas station attendant, and vice versa for that matter. And this probably is true for the most part. The highly paid employees of companies are, in the strictest sense of the word, themselves proletariat, but I doubt they would see themselves as gaining anything from an egalitarian society, no matter if that egalitarianism manifests as a country like the United States or England, only with a more robust welfare state and a strong workers' movement, or as a social democracy in the vein of the Scandinavian model, or egalitarianism manifested as full socialism. At the very least, rich workers will probably fear higher taxes, if not an overturn of a social order that places a higher value on their work over the work of others. And the matter is even further confused when we talk about people in management, themselves being wage employees of a company and not having any claim to ownership. However, they act and often view themselves as appendages of and having the same interests as the owners of the companies for which they work. Managers are such a difficult case when discussing class that I think it's best to put a pin in that topic and visit it in a future video. Unfortunately, being a worker doesn't guarantee class consciousness, even for those who would most benefit from an egalitarian society, let alone those who are comfortable with their standing in capitalism. Having said that, I think it's a good time to end the video here and commit to going over in further detail what class consciousness even is in the next video. Hopefully, it won't take another 2 weeks to get to it, but until then, thank you in solidarity. Take care of yourself and each other.